Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about Reconstruction today. Thanks, as always, for the slide templates from Susan Poger, a retired history teacher from Chappaqua, New York. All right, so we're going to surround ourselves with four key questions around the Reconstruction period. In case you're not sure, this is the period that immediately follows the Civil War. All right, so first off, it's important for us to remember that the Civil War, at least when it started, was not explicitly about ending slavery, but it was also about dealing with the seceded states, right? Lincoln and many other Republicans saw secession as tantamount to treason, and so after the war is over, these 11 states just don't automatically rejoin the Union. There needs to be an actual process for that to happen. And so that is more of the political question that we're going to be examining. The second question here is, how do we actually physically rebuild the South after the war? Because as you remember from the Civil War, especially if you think about Sherman's march to the sea, right, making Georgia howl, is we're dealing with a lot of physical destruction. The city of Richmond, a district of it, actually burned. And this is going to have a hefty price tag. And of course, now that the country is becoming one again, the entire country is going to be responsible for that financial burden. Additionally, we're going to look at an increasing level of westward expansion, particularly with regard to railroad construction. So it's not just a question about rebuilding the South, but also continuing to build the Union as it industrializes. Question three is essentially, how do we give, or what are the rights and freedoms of former slaves? And so they're called freedmen. That's a new term in case you're unfamiliar with that in the study of U.S. history, but that's really a key question there. What's the status of African Americans? And then lastly, how does checks and balances play a role in Reconstruction? So is it the president's job? Is it Congress's job, or is it the Supreme Court's job ultimately to proceed with this post-war process? So let's talk about Reconstruction before the war's over. So Lincoln, by the time 1863 rolls around, has a decent expectation that the Union will win this conflict. And so the first thing he does is actually proclaim this plan in the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And note the date, right? That's very shortly after the Gettysburg Address. So it's fairly early on. The war won't end until 1865. One of the ideas behind his plan is that he wants the new Southern government to be loyal to the Union. Of course, the Confederacy itself, in some ways, we could see as disloyal to the Union because of secession, right? That's at least one historical interpretation. So he doesn't necessarily need Republicans to fill these elected positions. In fact, I don't think Lincoln would have stood up for that necessarily. The radical Republicans did, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a presidential reconstruction plan. It's a proclamation by name after all. So he's not talking to Congress when he first determines this plan. Part of the plan was to pardon everyone except the highest ranking military officials. And so that's important for us to realize because, as far as Lincoln is concerned, the average soldier was not guilty of a lot of these war crimes. And he also just wants to proceed with life as usual by not punishing everyone that joined the Confederacy. And lastly, the reason behind the name, the 10% plan, was that it required 10% of the voting population as of the 1860 census to swear an oath of loyalty to the Union. And then they would establish a constitutional convention and set up a government, and then that state would be recognized by the Union. And it's important for us to just take a pause and realize that that 10% is only the voting population. That is not the entire population. So that excludes more than half of the population as of 1860. All right, so this plan is only adopted by three of the states that seceded: Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And we're going to see as we move forward, these states are going to have to take additional steps to actually guarantee that they remain recognized by the Union. So these three states developed those loyal assemblies that Lincoln asked for, and they really are not that powerful, right? So they're recognized, but we're not going to see representatives from these three states play a major role in the Reconstruction process. It's going to be the radical Republicans like Benjamin Wade, Henry Davis, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, they're the ones who are largely going to be controlling Reconstruction after Lincoln dies. So, speaking of Wade and Davis, they come up with their own plan for Reconstruction. So, this is the congressional plan, or the first congressional plan, for how to deal with the post war government. So you can see first and foremost that their requirement for loyalty is much higher, right? They require just under a majority, right? 50%, half of the voting population to swear an oath of loyalty to the Union. And their oath is called an ironclad oath, which, think about iron, it's much stronger. And the extra step of the ironclad oath was not only would they swear loyalty, but they also were supposed to say that they never voluntarily aided the rebellion, in other words, the Confederacy. And you can surmise that that's a lot harder to do, right? To actually say it and mean it, especially in the wake of the end of the Civil War when so much of the South was physically destroyed. There are a lot of people that are bitter and upset. They're returning to homes that don't really exist anymore in some cases. And so that, that's a very bitter pill for a lot of Southerners to swallow. If they swear this loyalty oath, or the ironclad oath that is, then they still have to proceed with a constitutional convention. And you'll see as we move forward, they're going to have to adopt all the new amendments that are added to the Constitution in order to become states. But when the Wade-Davis bill is adopted, that's not yet the case. All right. And lastly, the Wade-Davis bill required certain protections of the freedmen's freedoms. And we're going to see what those freedoms are in a future video. All right, I'm really just quickly going to touch upon these. This slide just elaborates. It does explain what happens to the Wade-Davis bill, but I'm not really going to talk about these two. I don't emphasize them too much in my class. But again, the ironclad oath just shows us how much stronger, arguably, the Wade-Davis bill was, or harsher, we might say, towards the South. Lincoln, in his 10% plan, in many ways just wanted to proceed as usual, and we can think about continuity and change. Think about Lincoln's position prior to the war. Again, at least at first, he didn't really want to do much to change the status quo. He did not want slavery to expand any further, but at least as a president, he was more pragmatic, and one could say that that would have only delayed the inevitable. But in any case, just thinking about Lincoln's position after the war, it's not necessarily that far off from his position beforehand. All right. So in any event, Lincoln ends up not vetoing per se, but he pocket vetoes the Wade-Davis bill. And what that means is that he just does not sign it. If you think about pocketing something, you're putting it in your pocket and you might forget about it, right? So Lincoln sort of ignores the Wade-Davis bill and it does not come to law. And some historians argue that Lincoln would have signed a modified Wade-Davis bill, but he's assassinated before that happens. All right, Jefferson Davis is arrested for war crimes, and so again, thinking about bitter pills to swallow, the South is going to respond. There's going to be a backlash to the ways in which some of the former Confederate leaders are treated in the wake of the war. And if you wanted to pause and analyze this political cartoon, go for it, but I want to keep these videos pretty short. All right, so the 13th Amendment is the first of a series of 3 amendments that are associated with the Reconstruction era. You can see that this one, again, was very early, almost immediately after the war ends. The language of the amendment is as follows: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, and Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So, translation. What this is saying, more or less, is that slavery is over. All right? And then this part is saying that it is up to Congress to enforce the amendment. So, we can just take a pause and think about what an amendment really is. I mean, an amendment is important and it protects rights and liberties, but you ultimately need to have all the other branches of government, not just Congress, to back that amendment up, or else it's useless. So the Freedmen's Bureau is one of the first programs that is adopted by Congress that's going to further determine the future of African Americans in not just the South, but the Union as a whole. It is created by, or its official name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Refugees is an interesting choice of words. there were many people that were not Southerners that actually were part of the Freedmen's Bureau. Many of them sponsor the Bureau itself, and the Freedmen's Bureau, you'll see in a moment, creates many schools for the children of freedmen, and many of the people that teach and run those schools were Northerners, and many of them are white. And so you're going to see a change in the Southern population, and in many ways, the South, at least in the early years of Reconstruction, was seen as quite progressive. Carpetbaggers. This cartoon sort of illustrates what a carpetbagger is, but let me just explain it. You guys may be too young for this, but I don't know if you remember the old Roadrunner cartoons and such, where a sort of a vagrant person, a person with no home, would walk around with a little bag attached to a stick, right? Sort of, think about that. And so, carpetbagger is a derogatory term for someone who picks up and moves somewhere for their political gain. All right, and so most of the time, carpetbaggers in this time period were associated with Northerners who moved south in order to run for office or even for economic gain. You also saw people that might be called carpetbaggers who might move to the south and buy up a factory and start a business because it's cheaper to run it. But for the most part, carpetbaggers were nicknames, bad nicknames that were given to politicians. So a carpetbagger, you didn't want to be called that. The Freedmen's Bureau, probably not surprised that it was not really seen in a positive light by a lot of white Southerners. This is a political cartoon that is depicting the freedmen as lazy, and they are, one of them sitting there strumming a ukulele, the other one's sitting on his bag of corn that presumably was given to him by the Freedmen's Bureau. And so, in terms of continuity and change, we could look all the way to times like the 80s when the conservative government started to push back on programs like welfare and blaming the recipients for becoming idle and lazy. But that's way ahead for you guys, but a very interesting parallel nonetheless. Freedmen's bureaus, although a step in a more progressive direction, were not particularly equal to the counterparts, the white schools that were available, although of course that varied based on how much money there was in a place. But Freedmen's Bureau schools typically house children of multiple grades. You can see that in this cartoon. There's a much older student in the back row, and you see a much younger student sitting in front of her. Oftentimes in one room, and oftentimes working with hand-me-down supplies or sharing supplies regardless of what grade the students were in. And so one of the major goals of the Freedmen's Bureau schools was to promote literacy among the children of former slaves. Let's take a break and pick up with a part 2 video on the presidential Reconstruction plan under Andrew Johnson. All right, thanks for listening and stay tuned.